just follow up on that? The difference, it seems to me, is the indefinite nature of it, right? I mean, because even when you have immigration detention, the Supreme Court says it has to be for a reasonable period of time, right? Same thing with a lot of the other kinds of detention you're talking about. The law of war says you can detain enemy combatants until the end of hostilities. How do we know what the end of hostilities here is? That's always been the problem, right? And so I guess, and the way that we've tried to deal with it is by saying, okay, we're going to have periodic review, right? So we don't know when we're going to let these people go, but we'll come back and revisit it every once in a while to make sure it's all okay, right? Well, that just sort of compounds the problem, it seems to me. How are you thinking about the time issue?
So it's a great question, and so the first component of the answer to it is, or the first component of a stab at the answer to it, because I think it's the question. It's ultimately, you're right. It's the question that is most difficult and most vexing and most irresolvable. Not all of the other statutes that we're talking about involve, a definite point of release. So particularly the mental illness cases do not. They are indefinite in very much the same sense, and bounded also only by periodic review. And if you look at the history of the sexual predator statutes, people don't get released. There's a few thousand people who have been in custody in the United States for very long periods of time, and they're not going anywhere because courts have judged that they have an irrepressible tendency to molest kids, and so I guess the first thing is don't overstate the premise. And that said, your question is still right? You have an end of hostilities that we all sort of feel is not going to come, and it's hard. So a few, I'm not going to pretend to have an ironclad answer to that question. There is none. Here's some things around the answer to it. One is that if you consider the word indefinite, we use it as a synonym colloquially in this context for never-ending, endless. But that's actually not what the word means. What the word means is lacking a definite endpoint, right, of undefined length. And if you look at, so both Guantanamo and Bagram and all the other detention the United States has engaged in since 9/11, that latter sense of the word is a much more precise usage than the former endless sense in which we all sort of intuitively think about it. Of the 800 people who've passed through Guantanamo, about 600 of them are no longer there. That is, they've been repatriated. Other dispositions of their cases other than long-term detentions have actually presented themselves. Also, and the irony of this is that, for a lot of people that we held in detention, indefinite detention, the indefiniteness actually worked to their advantage relative to the criminal justice system. So, for example, if you think about, when you remember in the early stage, the first detention case that we were all very concerned about as a society was Hamdi, right? And Hamdi is a U.S. national who's captured in Afghanistan and held in Norfolk. His case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. And people like me were very anxious on behalf of Hamdi because this was indefinite detention, there was no charge. So there was another detainee who's in very similar factual basis, which is John Walker Lind, also a U.S. national Taliban fighter. And John Walker Lind was prosecuted in the criminal justice system. And the irony is that people like me were saying, well, this is the way it should be done. It's much fairer. He gets a lawyer. He gets all these things that we associate with our comfort with the thing. John Walker Lind got 20 years in prison, and Hamdi was out in 3. And the last I heard of Lind's case was his lawyers were petitioning the president for executive clemency on the basis that he was unfair to him, the differential with respect to Hamdi, given that the facts of their cases were essentially the same. And so, so I guess the second point I would make is that indefinite is a double-edged sword, and it doesn't always mean, so often that periodic review of which you're very dismissive means something, and that we actually got rid of a lot of people through periodic review. And then the final point is that, for the core for which that is not true, you're absolutely right. This is the morally, unresolvable problem that you're going to be holding some group of people based on very imperfect information for a very long period of time. And I think that's just one of the things that we need to be candid about, and we need to decide, is there some point at which we are going to contemplate letting certain people go? Is there some time limit after which we want to force things into the criminal justice system or give up on it? But my point is, these are choices, and they're choices that don't go away if you pretend not to make them.
I believe there's a case that will come fairly shortly to the Supreme Court on material witness.
It was argued the other day.
What?
It was argued the other day.
Argued the other day, fine. Would you like to predict the outcome? And secondly, would you like to predict what impact, whatever the verdict is, might have on the broader issues you've been discussing?
So the material witness statute, first of all, as a general rule, I try never to predict the Supreme Court. I do think, whenever you have Ninth Circuit cases coming before the Supreme Court, there's a presumption that whatever the Ninth Circuit did, the Supreme Court will do the opposite. And that does suggest that what one might anticipate the result here to be. Look, the material witness statute is a instrument of value domestically and of limited application to the larger problem that we're talking about, right? Which is, which is focused mostly, not exclusively, but mostly on overseas people captured in a military or intelligence-oriented context, not in a traditional law enforcement setting. There are exceptions to that. I think the number of people held in under material witness warrants since 9/11 is something around 70, 75. So you're talking about a relatively small group relative to even the Guantanamo population, which is 800. Certainly relative to the larger detention pool. That said, look, this is an instrument that has been used. Tim McVeigh was initially arrested on a material witness warrant. It's an instrument that will continue to be used, that has been used, and about which the controversy is about a relatively circumscribed component of it, which is when you detain somebody under a material witness warrant in order to investigate them while you're holding them, and that the sort of material witness warrant is kind of a sham. Is that illegitimate? And I think that we're really not doing a whole lot of that anymore. I think, and that's probably a good thing.
Okay, we got time for one more question.
Okay.
I wanted to ask you about, you touched on this briefly, about those groups of people that get swept up inadvertently. They're not criminals, they're not terrorists. I'm thinking particularly of the group, the Uyghurs. Can you just address a little bit about what your thoughts are going forward in terms of policy around those groups?
Okay, so this is a great question. And, the poor Uyghurs, who not only have to be held for long periods of time, they have to be always talked about as the Uyghurs, right? But they're actually a very interesting and illustrative case, right? So any reasonable guidance that you gave to the US military in the fall of 2001, the Uyghurs, that group of Uyghurs, there were 23 of them, they were going to get picked up and held. Because what were we looking for? We were looking for guys, foreign people in Afghanistan taking military-style training under the auspices of the Taliban. So these Uyghurs, the Taliban really threw them a curveball. They gave them a training camp in Tora Bora. Oops. And so these guys come here to take some training and sort of to learn to resist the Chinese government. And they find themselves in Tora Bora. And what do they do when we start, bombing their camp and stuff? They put on civilian clothes, which of course is what they wear anyway, right? And they try to cross the border into Pakistan, which is exactly what all the guys we were catching were trying to do. So any reasonable screen you set up, you're going to capture these guys, you're going to take them. And and nobody disputes that we don't want to be holding them, right? So the military decided to free them quite early, even, in almost all of their cases before the thing became a public thing. And so at some level, it's a very good portrait of everything that is complicated here. You're going to set up a screen in which people like this are going to be caught, and you're going to realize that you don't want to be holding people, and you're going to be stuck with them. And that basic problem plays out not just over the course of this case and many other cases like it, but it's an inherent feature of a uniformless conflict in which you're detaining people based on their resemblance to a core over which you're afraid. And I think there's no principled answer to it other than set up a good screen, define your screens rigorously, be open to serious, wait a minute, I'm somebody other than who you think are. You create good processes for that kind of review, and accept that you are going to make errors in all directions. You're going to detain people whose detentions you regret, and you're going to free people whose freedom you regret. The opposite side of the Uyghur case is, and all the cases like it, and the Uyghurs, represent a larger class of people. The opposite end of that is the Kuwaitis who we freed him, and he went and blew himself up in Iraq and killed 14 people. And you will make mistakes in that direction too for exactly the same reason. And at the end of the day, the question is not whether we're going to make both of those mistakes, because we're going to make both of those mistakes. The question is whether, if anyone, someone is accountable when we make those mistakes. And I think one of the problems with right now, the current environment, is that there is no accountability for them. Everybody has plausible deniability. And one of the benefits, and I'll stop with this, one of the benefits of having a regime in which you actually make decisions is that when something goes wrong, as it surely will, you know who is accountable for it. Thank you all for coming.